Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The liar paradox. There exists a statement so simple that it collapses the foundations of truth itself. A sentence that devours its own meaning the moment it is spoken. And this is the liar paradox, a loop that has haunted logicians and philosophers for over 2,000 years. The paradox is most famously expressed in a single declaration: this statement is false, and the mind recoils at what follows. For if the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims. But if it is false, then it must be true because it correctly identifies itself as false. And so the cycle begins again, spiraling endlessly, without resolution, without escape. The ancient Greeks were the first to wrestle with this demon of language, and Epimenides, the Cretan, is often credited with an early version when he declared that all Cretans are liars, which implies that if he himself is a Cretan, then his statement must be a lie, which means Cretans might actually tell the truth, which means his statement might be true, which means it is false again, and the contradiction churns without mercy. Philosophers have spent centuries trying to solve or dissolve the paradox, and some argue that self-referential statements like this are simply meaningless, that language breaks down when it tries to refer to itself in this way, while others suggest that truth is not binary, but exists on a spectrum, allowing for statements that are neither fully true nor fully false, hovering in some undefined space between. Bertrand Russell encountered similar contradictions when developing set theory, and discovered that self-reference could destroy the entire logical framework of mathematics, leading him to create new systems that carefully excluded paradoxes like the liar from ever forming. The paradox also influenced Kurt Gödel, whose incompleteness theorems proved that within any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven, which itself echoes the spirit of the liar paradox, the idea that truth and provability are not always the same thing. Some modern logicians have proposed paraconsistent logics, systems where contradictions can exist without causing the entire structure to collapse, allowing the liar paradox to be true and false simultaneously without forcing us to accept that everything is true, which would render logic useless. Others reject the paradox entirely, claiming that natural language is too vague and imprecise to support rigorous logical analysis, that the liar paradox is a quirk of grammar rather than a deep philosophical problem. Yet the paradox persists, refusing to die, surfacing in new forms, across disciplines, from computer science to legal theory, anywhere that self-reference appears. Consider a sign that reads, "Ignore this sign," or a rule that states there are no rules, or a person who says everything I say is a lie, and the same strange loop emerges, the same dizzying collapse of meaning. The liar paradox forces confrontation with the limits of language, logic, and truth itself, suggesting that reality may not always fit neatly into categories of true and false, that some truths may be inherently unstable, slipping through the fingers the moment they are grasped. It reminds us that words are not perfect mirrors of reality, but tools shaped by human thought, and sometimes those tools turn on themselves, revealing cracks in the structures we build to make sense of existence. The omnipotence paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it? A theologian proclaims that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, able to do anything, and this claim is central to many religious traditions. Reflects the idea that God is unlimited, unconstrained, the ultimate being with ultimate power, and yet a simple question reveals a logical puzzle, a challenge to the coherence of omnipotence. And the question asks whether God can create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it, And this question seems innocent, but it creates a dilemma. Because if God can create such a rock, then there is something God cannot do, namely, lift the rock. And so God is not omnipotent. And if God cannot create such a rock, then again, there is something God cannot do, namely, create the unliftable rock. And so again, God is not omnipotent. And either way, omnipotence seems impossible, seems self-contradictory. And this is the omnipotence paradox, also called the stone paradox, a puzzle that has troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries, forcing them to clarify what omnipotence means, what powers an all-powerful being could and could not have, and whether the concept of omnipotence is even coherent. Imagine the scenario concretely. God stands in a cosmic workshop, materials at hand, ready to create, and God decides to make a rock, but not just any rock, a rock so massive, so heavy, so immovable that even God's infinite power cannot lift it. And God sets to work, shaping matter, compressing mass, until the rock is complete. And then God tries to lift it, and the rock does not budge. God pulls and pushes and exerts all divine force, but the rock remains on the ground, unliftable. And this seems to show that God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot do, cannot lift this particular rock. And yet if God never creates the rock, if God admits that creating such a rock is impossible, then this also shows God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot create. And the paradox presents a forced choice. Neither option preserves omnipotence, and the concept seems to collapse under its own logic. The paradox can be generalized beyond rocks. The question could be whether God can create a task so difficult that God cannot complete it, whether God can create a being so powerful that God cannot control it, whether God can make a rule so binding that God cannot break it, and in each case the same structure emerges. Either God can create the limiting thing, in which case God is limited by it, or God cannot create it, in which case God is limited by the inability to create it. And either way, God's power has boundaries, and omnipotence seems impossible. And this suggests that omnipotence might be an incoherent concept, might not be logically possible, might be like a square circle or a married bachelor, something that sounds meaningful but actually combines contradictory ideas and cannot exist. Theologians and philosophers have developed several responses to the paradox, attempting to show that omnipotence is coherent and that the paradox rests on misunderstandings or ambiguities. One common response is to restrict omnipotence to logically possible tasks, to say that God can do anything that is logically possible but cannot do things that are logically impossible, and creating a rock that an omnipotent being cannot lift is logically impossible, is self-contradictory, because omnipotence includes the ability to lift anything, and so a rock that cannot be lifted by an omnipotent being is a logical impossibility, like a square circle. And God's inability to create logical impossibilities does not limit God's power in any meaningful sense, because logical impossibilities are not real tasks, are not things that could be done. And so excluding them from the scope of omnipotence is not a limitation but a clarification. Visualize omnipotence as a set of powers: the power to create anything logically possible, the power to know anything knowable, the power to do anything doable. And the set does not include impossible things, does not include making square circles or creating married bachelors or lifting unliftable rocks. Because these are not tasks, are not possibilities, are just combinations of words that do not refer to any coherent state of affairs. And just as we do not think a mathematician is limited because they cannot prove that 2 + 2 = 5, we should not think God is limited because God cannot do logically impossible things, because these are not things, are not genuine constraints on power. Another response distinguishes between God's essential attributes and God's contingent choices, and argues that omnipotence means God has the power to do anything consistent with God's nature. And part of God's nature is being omnipotent, and so God cannot create a situation where God lacks omnipotence. because that would contradict God's nature. But this is not a limitation on God's power. It is a feature of what God is. And just as God cannot make God not exist, because God is a necessary being, God cannot make God not omnipotent, because omnipotence is essential to God. And the rock scenario asks God to create a contradiction, to remain omnipotent while becoming not omnipotent, and this is incoherent. And God's inability to do it reflects logical necessity, not weakness. A third response embraces the paradox and argues that it shows omnipotence is paradoxical, is not a coherent concept, and rather than defending omnipotence, we should acknowledge that God's power, while immense, is not literally unlimited, that there are things God cannot do, and this is not a defect in God but a recognition that power, like any concept, has logical limits. And some religious traditions, particularly in Eastern philosophy, are comfortable with divine paradoxes, with the idea that ultimate reality transcends logical categories, and the paradox of omnipotence is just one of many paradoxes that arise when finite human concepts are applied to the infinite divine. The paradox also appears in discussions of free will and divine foreknowledge, because if God knows the future infallibly, then God knows what choices humans will make. And if God knows what choices humans will make, then humans cannot choose otherwise, because if they could, then God's knowledge would be wrong. And so divine omniscience seems to eliminate human free will. And this creates a dilemma similar to the omnipotence paradox. Either God is not omniscient, does not know future free choices, or humans are not free, do not have genuine choice. And both options are unpalatable to many theologians who want to preserve both divine perfection and human freedom. And various solutions have been proposed, involving timeless knowledge, middle knowledge, open theism, but none has won universal acceptance, and the tension remains. The omnipotence paradox reveals that the concept of unlimited power is more complex than it first appears, that power operates within logical and conceptual constraints, and that saying God is all-powerful does not mean God can do literally anything we can describe in words, but only that God can do anything that is genuinely possible, anything that makes sense, and the paradox serves as a test case, forces clarification of what omnipotence means, pushes theologians to be precise about divine attributes, and shows that even the most basic theological claims require careful, philosophical analysis to be made coherent. God stands before the rock, or does not create the rock, and the paradox hangs in the air, a logical puzzle about power and limits, about possibility and coherence. And the answer depends on how omnipotence is defined, on whether logical impossibilities are excluded, on whether God's nature places constraints on divine action. And different traditions answer differently. Some saying God transcends logic, some saying logic constrains even God. And the omnipotence paradox remains, not fully resolved, still debated, still used to challenge and clarify theological concepts. And the rock sits there, hypothetical and impossible, a monument to the difficulties of thinking clearly about ultimate power, about infinite abilities, about what it means to say God can do anything. And the paradox persists, elegant and troubling, a reminder that even divine attributes, even the powers of an unlimited being, must answer to logic, must cohere, must make sense, and that the concept of omnipotence, for all its simplicity, conceals depths and difficulties that philosophy continues to explore. The paradox of analysis, how explaining something makes it meaningless. A philosopher attempts to analyze a concept, to provide a definition that captures its meaning precisely, and suppose the concept is knowledge, and the philosopher proposes that knowledge is justified true belief. And this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what knowledge is, should illuminate the concept by breaking it down into simpler components. But here emerges a paradox articulated by C.H. Langford and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore, because if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning, must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect, would not capture what knowledge really is. But if they are synonymous, then stating the analysis provides no new information, becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying knowledge is knowledge, which is trivial, tells us nothing. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. If it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. And this is the paradox of analysis, a puzzle about whether conceptual analysis is even possible, whether we can both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that concept. Imagine presenting the analysis to someone who understands the concept of knowledge, who uses the word correctly, who can distinguish cases where knowledge is present from cases where it is absent, and you tell them that knowledge is justified true belief. And if they already knew this, if the definition merely makes explicit what was implicit in their understanding, then the analysis is correct but uninformative, tells them nothing new. But if they learn something, if the analysis reveals something they did not already know, then it seems the analysis is changing the concept rather than analysing it, is offering a new concept rather than clarifying the old one. And either way, the analysis fails to do what philosophical analysis is supposed to do, both correctly identify meaning and provide insight. The paradox challenges the entire enterprise of conceptual analysis, challenges the method that has been central to analytic philosophy for over a century. The method of taking ordinary concepts like knowledge, justice, truth, and providing precise definitions. And if the paradox cannot be resolved, then conceptual analysis is either impossible or pointless. Either it cannot be done correctly, or when done correctly, it provides no insight. And this threatens one of philosophy's main methods, forces philosophers to reconsider what they're doing when they offer analyses, what counts as success and whether analysis is discovery or stipulation. Visualize the paradox as a dilemma. On one horn, the analysans and analysandum are synonymous, have the same meaning, and the analysis is correct but trivial, like saying a bachelor is an unmarried man, which is true but uninformative because anyone who understands the word bachelor already knows this. And on the other horn, the analysans and analysandum differ in meaning, and the analysis is informative but incorrect, provides new information but does not capture what the original concept meant. And either way, the analysis fails to achieve the goal of being both correct and informative, and the paradox seems to show that this goal is impossible, that correctness and informativeness are incompatible in conceptual analysis. One response distinguishes between sense and reference, between how a concept is presented and what it refers to, and argues that an analysis can have the same reference as the analysandum while differing in sense, and so the analysis is informative because it presents the concept differently, makes explicit aspects that were implicit even though it refers to the same thing, and the analysis knowledge is justified. True belief is informative because even though knowledge and justified true belief refer to the same set of cases, they present those cases differently, one as a simple concept and the other as a complex structure. And learning the structure is learning something new, even though the reference remains the same. And this response draws on Frege's distinction between sense and reference, uses it to explain how analyses can be both correct and informative. Another response appeals to implicit versus explicit knowledge, argues that competent speakers have implicit understanding of concepts, understand how to use them correctly, but lack explicit understanding, cannot state the definition, and conceptual analysis makes implicit knowledge explicit, converts procedural knowledge into propositional knowledge, and this conversion is informative even though it does not add to what was implicitly known, and the analysis is correct because it captures the implicit understanding and informative, because it makes that understanding explicit and available for reflection. And so the paradox dissolves because correctness and informativeness are compatible when we recognize that knowledge comes in implicit and explicit forms. A third response questions whether analyses are meant to be synonymous, argues that philosophical analyses are not claims about linguistic meaning, but claims about the nature of things, about what knowledge really is, about its essential properties, and knowledge is justified. True belief is not a claim about what the word means, but a claim about what knowledge consists in, about its metaphysical structure. And this claim can be informative, even if it is necessarily true, even if knowledge could not be otherwise, because discovering necessary truths is informative. Learning that water is H2O was informative, even though it is necessarily true that water is H2O, and so philosophical analysis is more like scientific discovery than like lexicography, more like finding out what things are than like defining words. And the paradox assumes the wrong model of analysis. The paradox also connects to debates about analyticity and the analytic-synthetic distinction, because if analyses are analytic truths, true in virtue of meaning, then they should be trivial, should be knowable a priori just by understanding the concepts. But many proposed analyses are controversial, are rejected by competent speakers, and this suggests either that analyses are not analytic, or that analyticity is more complex than traditionally thought. And Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction can be seen as embracing the paradox, as arguing that there are no purely analytic truths, that all statements are revisable, that meaning and fact are not sharply separated, and so philosophical analyses are not discoveries of meaning, but proposals for how to understand concepts, and their value is pragmatic, depends on whether they illuminate, rather than whether they are correct in some absolute sense. The paradox remains unresolved. Different philosophers offer different solutions based on different theories of meaning and different conceptions of what philosophical analysis aims to achieve. And the paradox continues to challenge the methodology of analytic philosophy, forces ongoing reflection on what analysis is, what it can accomplish, and whether the goals of correctness and informativeness can be reconciled, or whether philosophy must choose between them. And the concept of knowledge sits waiting for analysis, and the philosopher proposes justified true belief. And the question remains whether this is a discovery or a stipulation, whether it is correct or informative, or neither or both. And the paradox persists, a puzzle about philosophy's methods, about whether conceptual analysis is possible, about the relationship between understanding and articulation, between implicit grasp and explicit formulation, and whether the attempt to make our concepts precise enriches or distorts them, captures their meaning or creates new meanings. And the paradox endures as a permanent challenge to philosophical methodology, a question about whether philosophy can deliver on its promise to analyze and clarify concepts, or whether the very attempt to analyze creates a problem that cannot be solved without giving up either the goal of correctness or the goal of informativeness. And the analysis hangs there, proposed but problematic, informative or correct, but not both, and the paradox remains. The paradox of free will, why choice seems both real and impossible. A person stands at a crossroads, two paths diverging, and must choose which way to go. And the person deliberates, weighs options, considers consequences, and makes a decision, chooses one path. And this choosing feels free, feels like the person could have chosen otherwise, like the decision was truly up to them, genuinely within their control. And yet the person's decision is the result of brain processes, is caused by prior states of neurons, by chemical reactions, by electrical signals, and these processes are themselves caused by earlier states, by genetics and experience and current circumstances, and the chain of causation extends back through the person's life, through evolution, through the physical history of the universe. And at no point in this causal chain is there a break, a moment where cause gives way to free choice, where determinism is suspended. And if every event has causes, if the present is determined by the past plus the laws of physics, then the person's decision was determined long before the moment of choosing, was inevitable given prior conditions. And the feeling of free choice is an illusion. The decision was never really up to the person, could not have been otherwise. And this creates the paradox of free will, the apparent incompatibility between the subjective experience of freedom and the objective reality of causal determination. Between the feeling that we choose and the fact that our choices are caused, and this paradox has troubled philosophers for millennia, generated enormous literature, produced multiple attempted solutions, but never achieved consensus. And the problem persists as one of the central questions in philosophy, ethics, and the nature of human agency. Imagine the person's brain at the moment of decision, neurons firing in specific patterns, dopamine and serotonin modulating activity, and these patterns cause the decision, determine which path is chosen, and the patterns themselves were caused by prior brain states, by sensory inputs, by memories activated, by emotional states, and these prior states had their own causes, and the causal chain is unbroken, and nowhere in this chain is there room for free will, for choices that are not caused, for decisions that could have been different given exactly the same prior conditions. And if determinism is true, if the laws of physics determine everything, then free will seems impossible, seems to be a conceptual confusion, and yet the feeling of freedom persists, and we hold people responsible for their actions, praise and blame them, treat them as if their choices were free, and the legal system, morality, social practices all assume free will, assume that people could have done otherwise. And the paradox is that free will seems both necessary for responsibility and impossible given causation. The paradox generates three main positions: compatibilism, which says free will is compatible with determinism, incompatibilism, which says they are incompatible, and libertarianism, not political libertarianism, but metaphysical libertarianism, which accepts incompatibility and argues that determinism is false, that humans have genuine free will, and different philosophers defend each position with different arguments, and no consensus emerges, and the debate continues, and the paradox remains unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable, and this might reflect a deep feature of human existence, that we cannot escape the feeling of freedom, even if we become convinced intellectually that freedom is impossible, that the first-person perspective of deliberation requires treating ourselves as free even if the third-person perspective of science shows that we are determined. Visualize determinism as a timeline. The state of the universe at one time, plus the laws of physics, determines the state at the next time. And this determination is complete, includes everything, includes brain states and decisions, and the timeline is like a film that has already been recorded, and we are living through it, experiencing events as they unfold. But the sequence is fixed, was fixed by initial conditions billions of years ago, and our decisions are frames in this film, are determined by previous frames. And no alternative timeline is possible given the initial conditions and the laws. And if this picture is correct, then the feeling of having options, of being able to choose differently, is illusory. We could not have chosen differently. The decision was already encoded in the prior state of the universe, and we are not free. Compatibilists respond that this picture misunderstands what free will requires, that free will does not require the ability to have chosen differently given exactly the same prior conditions, does not require breaking the causal chain, but only requires that our choices flow from our own desires, values, character, that we are not coerced, not forced, not manipulated, and as long as the person's decision resulted from their own deliberation, their own reasons, they acted freely, even though their deliberation was caused, even though their reasons were determined, And free will is compatible with determinism because free will is about the source of action, about whether it comes from the agent's own psychology, not about whether it is uncaused. Incompatibilists reject compatibilism, argue that if determinism is true, then everything we do was determined by factors beyond our control. By genetics we did not choose, by environments we did not create, by causal chains that began before we were born. And we are not genuinely responsible for actions that were determined by factors beyond our control. And compatibilist free will is not real freedom, but is a verbal trick, is redefining freedom to make it compatible with determinism. And genuine freedom, the kind required for moral responsibility, requires that we could have done otherwise, requires that our choices are not determined. And since determinism is probably true, given physics, genuine free will probably does not exist, and moral responsibility is problematic. Libertarians argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics shows that the universe is not deterministic, that there is genuine randomness, genuine indeterminacy at the quantum level, and this indeterminacy allows for free will, allows for choices that are not determined by prior states. But critics respond that randomness is not freedom, that random neural processes do not give us control over our actions, do not make us responsible, and adding randomness to determinism does not create free will, creates only determinism plus chance, and neither determination nor chance gives us the control required for responsibility. The paradox of free will also has practical implications for criminal justice, for morality, for how we treat each other, because if free will is an illusion, then punishment seems unjustified, seems cruel, and blame seems inappropriate, and we should respond to harmful behaviour with rehabilitation or prevention rather than retribution. And yet the practice of holding people responsible seems essential to social life, seems unavoidable even if philosophically problematic, and we continue to blame and praise, punish and reward, as if free will exists, and perhaps this is necessary. Perhaps human social life requires treating people as responsible, even if the metaphysical foundations are shaky. The person stands at the crossroads, deliberates, chooses, and walks down one path, and whether this choice was free remains disputed, remains one of philosophy's hardest questions, and the paradox endures. Free will seems both essential and impossible, both real and illusory, and the tension between these perspectives remains unresolved, and perhaps the tension is permanent, is a feature of human existence that cannot be eliminated, that we must live with the subjective feeling of freedom while recognizing the objective reality of causation, and the paradox of free will persists as a permanent puzzle about human agency, about responsibility, about whether we are authors of our actions or merely characters in a predetermined story. And the question remains open, continues to generate debate, continues to matter for ethics and law and self-understanding. And the crossroads remains, the paths diverge, the choice is made, and whether it was truly free remains one of philosophy's deepest and most enduring questions. The paradox of tolerance, when being open-minded means destroying open-mindedness. A liberal society values tolerance, values the freedom to believe different things, to practice different religions, to hold different political views, to live in different ways. And this tolerance is seen as a virtue, as essential to freedom and democracy, as the foundation of peaceful coexistence in diverse societies. And the principle seems clear. We should tolerate all views and practices, should allow maximum freedom, should not suppress beliefs or ways of life just because we disagree with them. And yet a problem emerges, a paradox first articulated clearly by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, which asks what a tolerant society should do when faced with intolerance, when confronted by movements that reject tolerance itself, that seek to destroy the open society and replace it with authoritarianism, that demand the right to spread hate and silence opposition. And if the tolerant society tolerates, these intolerant movements, if it grants them freedom to organize and spread their views, then the intolerant movements will eventually gain power and destroy tolerance itself, will shut down free speech, will persecute minorities, will end democracy, and the tolerant society will have tolerated itself out of existence. And this is the paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the destruction of tolerance, that to preserve a tolerant society, it may be necessary to be intolerant toward intolerance, to refuse to tolerate those who would destroy tolerance. Imagine a democracy where free speech is protected, where all political views are allowed, where movements can organize and campaign and attempt to win power through elections. And now, imagine a fascist movement that explicitly rejects democracy, that promises to seize power and end elections and establish dictatorship. And this movement uses the freedoms of the democratic system to grow, uses free speech to spread propaganda, uses freedom of assembly to recruit followers, uses democratic procedures to gain seats in parliament, and at each stage, the democratic society faces a choice. Do we tolerate this movement? Do we allow it to continue operating within the system, even though its goal is to destroy the system? Or do we suppress it? Do we ban the movement, arrest its leaders, prevent it from spreading its message? And if we suppress it, are we betraying our own principles? Are we becoming intolerant ourselves? And if we do not suppress it, are we complicit in our own destruction? Are we naive? Are we allowing democracy to commit suicide? Popper's answer was that we should not tolerate the intolerant, that tolerance is not a suicide pact, that a society that wishes to remain tolerant must be willing to defend itself against movements that seek to destroy tolerance, and this means that tolerance has limits, that it does not extend to those who would abuse it to eliminate tolerance. And Popper acknowledged that this is paradoxical, that the tolerant society must practice intolerance, must suppress certain views, must limit freedom in order to preserve freedom. But he argued that this is necessary, that the alternative is the death of tolerance, and history supports this. Societies that tolerated fascist movements in the 1920s and 1930s saw those movements seize power and establish brutal dictatorships. And the lesson is that tolerance must be defended, that it cannot be absolute, that there are views and movements that cannot be accommodated within a free society because their goal is to end freedom. But this creates difficult questions about where to draw the line, about which views count as intolerably intolerant, about who decides, about what methods of suppression are legitimate. Because if we ban every movement that seems threatening, if we suppress every view that makes us uncomfortable, then we are no longer a tolerant society. We have become the oppressors. We have done the work of the intolerant for them. And so the paradox is not fully resolved by saying we should not tolerate intolerance, because we need principles to determine what counts as intolerance. What level of threat justifies suppression, and whether suppression means banning speech, banning organizations, arresting people, or merely refusing to engage, refusing to give platforms, refusing to treat intolerant views as legitimate options in public debate. Visualize a spectrum of intolerance. On one end are views that are merely offensive or unpopular, views that challenge prevailing norms, views that make some people uncomfortable, and these views, even if we find them objectionable, should be tolerated in a free society, should be allowed to be expressed and debated, because tolerance means accepting that people will hold views we dislike, and suppressing offensive views is censorship, is the tyranny of the majority, is the opposite of the tolerance we claim to value. And on the other end of the spectrum are movements that actively seek to destroy democratic institutions, that incite violence, that organize to strip rights from minorities, that threaten the basic conditions of a free society. And these movements, Popper argues, need not be tolerated, can be suppressed to protect the tolerant society. But the middle of the spectrum is murky, filled with cases where reasonable people disagree about whether a movement or view crosses the line. And this is where the paradox bites hardest, where we must make judgments without clear rules, where any decision risks either tolerating too much and allowing intolerance to grow, or suppressing too much and becoming intolerant ourselves. Some philosophers argue that the paradox can be resolved through procedural rules, through formal commitments to democratic processes. A tolerant society tolerates all views that accept the democratic framework, that agree to compete peacefully for power, that accept the results of elections and respect the rights of others, but it does not tolerate movements that reject these procedures, that seek power through violence or intimidation, that refuse to accept electoral defeat. And this procedural approach provides a clear line. Tolerance extends to those who play by the rules, not to those who seek to overturn the rules. But critics note that even this approach involves substantive value judgments, because the democratic framework itself embodies values like equality and freedom. And so we are saying we tolerate all views except those that reject our core values. And this is not neutral tolerance, but partisan tolerance, tolerance of a specific range of views that we have already deemed acceptable. Others argue that the solution involves distinguishing between tolerating views and tolerating actions, that a truly tolerant society allows people to hold and express any beliefs, but does not allow them to act on beliefs that harm others. So expressing racist views might be tolerated, but discriminatory actions are not. Advocating for dictatorship might be tolerated, but attempting a coup is not. And this distinction seems to preserve free thought and speech while preventing harm, but it faces difficulties because speech can cause harm, hate speech can incite violence, propaganda can radicalize people, and drawing the line between harmless expression and harmful action is not straightforward. And some argue that by the time intolerant movements act, it may be too late, that tolerant societies must suppress intolerant speech before it metastasizes into intolerant action. The paradox also has a psychological dimension, because tolerating intolerance is emotionally difficult, requires accepting that people will spread views you find abhorrent, will organize against values you hold dear, will seek to undermine the society you want to preserve. And this acceptance is painful, creates tension, and there is a constant temptation to suppress, to silence, to refuse to tolerate, and distinguishing between legitimate suppression of genuine threats and illegitimate censorship of mere disagreement requires judgment, requires resisting the urge to label all opposing views as intolerable, requires humility about our own fallibility. And these are difficult virtues to maintain, especially in polarized times when every political disagreement feels existential. The tolerant society stands at the edge, welcoming diverse views, protecting freedom, and watching as intolerant movements test the boundaries, push the limits, demand the right to destroy the very system that protects them. And the society must decide, must draw a line, must say some things cannot be tolerated, some movements cannot be accommodated. And in drawing that line, the society becomes less than perfectly tolerant, accepts that tolerance has limits, that the open society must defend itself. And the paradox does not disappear, but is managed, lived with, navigated through judgment and vigilance. And Popper's warning echoes: unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, and so tolerance must be limited, must exclude those who would destroy it. And this is not a betrayal of tolerance, but its preservation. Not a contradiction, but a recognition that all principles have boundaries, that values must be defended, and that the truly tolerant society is one that tolerates everything except intolerance. And the paradox remains, uncomfortable and unresolved, a permanent feature of liberal democracy, a reminder that freedom is fragile, that it must be actively maintained, and that tolerance for all its virtues is not enough by itself, must be supplemented with vigilance, with judgment, with the willingness to say no, to draw lines, to defend the open society against those who would close it. And the tension persists, always present, always requiring balance, and the paradox endures. The paradox of the court, when a student's promise becomes impossible to keep. An ancient story tells of a law teacher named Protagoras and his student Euathlus, and they make an agreement. The student is too poor to pay tuition up front, and so they agree that the student will pay the teacher after winning his first court case, and the teacher provides instruction, teaches the student rhetoric and law and argumentation, and the student completes his training, becomes skilled in legal reasoning, but then the student never takes a case, never appears in court, never wins anything, and years pass and the teacher has not been paid, and finally the teacher sues the student, takes him to court to demand payment. And now the paradox emerges because the case creates a logical impossibility, a situation where no judgment can be coherent, where the law contradicts itself. And this is the paradox of the court, also called Protagoras' paradox, a puzzle about legal reasoning, contracts, and self-reference that has no satisfactory solution. Imagine the trial. The teacher presents his case, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will order the student to pay, and the student will be legally obligated to pay the agreed tuition, and second that if he loses the lawsuit, then the student has won his first case, and according to the original agreement, the student must pay after winning his first case, and so, either way, the student must pay, whether the court rules for the teacher or for the student. The contract ensures payment, and this argument seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot avoid payment, that filing the lawsuit was a clever move, that forces the student into a position where any outcome requires payment. But now the student, trained in rhetoric by the teacher himself, presents a counter-argument of equal force, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will rule in his favour, and he will not be legally obligated to pay, and second that if he loses the lawsuit, then he has not won his first case, and according to the original agreement, he only pays after winning his first case, and so either way, he does not have to pay. Whether the court rules for him or against him, the contract protects him from payment, and this argument also seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot be forced to pay, that the lawsuit was a mistake that creates a situation where no outcome requires payment. Visualize the judge sitting in court, listening to both arguments, recognizing that both are logically valid, both follow from the premises, both reach opposite conclusions, and the judge must render a verdict, must decide whether the student pays or does not pay. But any decision seems arbitrary, seems to violate logic, because if the judge rules for the teacher, then the student wins his first case and does not have to pay, according to the contract. And if the judge rules for the student, then the student loses and does have to pay, according to the contract. And so, the judge's decision determines the opposite of what it declares, creates a self-contradicting outcome, and the law becomes incoherent, and the case cannot be decided without paradox. The paradox reveals a problem with self-referential contracts, contracts whose terms depend on the outcome of litigation about those very terms, because such contracts create loops, create situations where the contract's fulfillment depends on whether the contract is enforced, and whether it is enforced depends on whether it is fulfilled. And this circular dependency generates contradictions, makes it impossible to apply the law consistently, and the paradox shows that some contracts, even if agreed to voluntarily by competent parties, are legally unenforceable. Not because they violate public policy or lack consideration, but because they are logically incoherent, because no court can implement them without contradiction. One proposed resolution is to distinguish between two different questions: the question of whether the student owes the teacher money according to the contract, and the question of whether the court should order the student to pay, and these are separate issues. The contract might create an obligation that the court nonetheless refuses to enforce, and the court could rule in favour of the student on the narrow question of whether the lawsuit succeeds, while still recognising that the student has a moral obligation under the contract to pay once he wins his first case elsewhere, and this resolution separates legal enforcement from contractual obligation, allows both arguments to be partially correct. The teacher is right that the student owes money, the student is right that the court should not order payment, and the paradox dissolves because the two contradictory outcomes apply to different questions. Another resolution appeals to temporal priority, arguing that the lawsuit itself does not count as the student's first case for purposes of the contract, because the contract was made before the lawsuit, and counting the lawsuit as the first case would mean the contract refers to itself, which creates the paradox. And so the court should interpret the contract as referring to the first case other than the lawsuit about the contract itself. And under this interpretation, if the teacher wins the lawsuit, the student must pay, because the lawsuit is not the first case that triggers payment. And if the student wins the lawsuit, the student does not pay, because the student still has not won a first case other than this one. And the paradox is resolved by excluding self-referential applications of the contract terms. A third resolution argues that the contract is void because it is impossible to perform, because there is no possible world where the terms are satisfied without contradiction, and impossible contracts are unenforceable, and so the judge should declare the contract void and dismiss the case, leaving the student with no legal obligation, but perhaps a moral obligation to pay the teacher for services rendered. And this resolution sacrifices the contract to preserve logical coherence, treats the paradox as showing that the agreement was fatally flawed from the beginning. The paradox also raises questions about the limits of freedom of contract, about whether parties should be allowed to make any agreement they choose, or whether law should refuse to enforce agreements that are logically incoherent. And most legal systems recognize some limits, refuse to enforce contracts that are impossible, illegal, or against public policy, and the paradox of the court suggests adding logical coherence as another limit, another requirement for enforceability. And this means that contracting parties cannot create obligations that are self-referentially paradoxical, cannot make agreements whose terms depend on their own enforcement in ways that generate contradictions. The paradox has modern analogues in cases involving conditional gifts and trusts, where someone leaves property to another person on condition that the recipient perform some act. And if the act is defined in terms of legal outcomes about the gift itself, then paradoxes can arise, similar to the ancient case of the teacher and student, and courts have developed various doctrines to handle these cases, generally interpreting conditions to avoid self-reference, to prevent the kind of logical loops that the paradox of the court exemplifies. The courtroom stands empty, the ancient case unresolved, the judge unable to render coherent judgment, and the paradox remains a teaching tool in logic and law, an illustration of how self-reference creates problems, how circular definitions generate contradictions, and how even voluntary agreements between competent parties can be unenforceable if their structure is logically incoherent. And Protagoras and Euathlus remain frozen in their dispute, both right and both wrong, both entitled to payment and entitled to refuse payment. And the paradox persists as a reminder that logic constrains law, that not everything that can be agreed to can be enforced, and that self-reference, whether in contracts or in statements or in rules, is a source of paradox that must be handled carefully to avoid contradiction. The phantom limb. Paradox: why missing body parts still feel present. A soldier loses an arm in combat. The limb is amputated, no longer exists, no longer is connected to the body, and yet the soldier feels the arm, feels it present, feels sensations in fingers that are not there, feels the arm moving, feels it itching, feels pain in the missing hand. And this sensation is vivid, is compelling, is indistinguishable from sensations in real limbs. And this is the phantom limb phenomenon experienced by the vast majority of amputees, where missing body parts continue to be felt, continue to be represented in consciousness. And the paradox is that the brain maintains a representation of a limb that no longer exists, continues to generate sensations attributed to that limb, continues to include it in the body schema, despite clear evidence from vision and from direct inspection that the limb is absent. And this persistence reveals something deep about how the brain constructs body representations, shows that body schemas are not simply reflections of current physical structure, but are neural constructs that can outlive the body parts they represent. And phantom limbs demonstrate that the sense of embodiment is generated centrally, is maintained by brain processes that do not require peripheral input. And the phenomenon raises questions about the relationship between body and brain, about how sensations are localized, about what it means for a body part to be yours when that part no longer exists. Imagine the experience from the inside. You lost your hand months ago. The physical hand is gone, and yet you feel it. Feel the fingers, can feel yourself making a fist, opening the hand, moving fingers that are not there. And these phantom movements feel exactly like real movements, involve the same motor intentions, the same kinesthetic sensations. And sometimes the phantom hand is in uncomfortable positions, cramped or twisted, and you cannot move it, cannot relieve the discomfort. And this frozen phantom is intensely frustrating, is painful, because you feel the limb but cannot control it, cannot adjust it. And the pain is real, is neurological, is generated by the brain but is felt as coming from the missing hand. And this localization is puzzling because there is no hand, no physical location where the sensations could be occurring. And yet the sensations are localized there, are felt as arising from a specific spatial location that happens to be empty. The phantom limb phenomenon reveals that body representations are maintained in the somatosensory cortex, in the motor cortex, in the parietal lobe, and these representations do not simply disappear when a limb is removed, do not automatically update to reflect the new body configuration, and instead the neural circuitry that represented the limb continues to be active, continues to generate activity patterns that are interpreted as sensations in the missing limb, and this persistent activity is what creates phantom sensations, is what maintains the feeling of presence and understanding. This has led to treatments, has led to therapies that attempt to reorganize the somatosensory cortex to reduce phantom pain by providing feedback that the limb is gone, and mirror therapy, where amputees use mirrors to create the visual illusion that the missing limb is present, has proven effective, helps reduce pain and unfreeze frozen phantoms by providing visual feedback that allows the brain to update its body representation. Visualize the somatosensory cortex as containing a map of the body, a homunculus where different regions represent different body parts, and this map is established during development, is maintained throughout life, and when a limb is amputated, the corresponding region of cortex does not simply go silent, does not become inactive, and instead neighbouring regions begin to invade, begin to colonize the deferented cortex, and inputs from the face or from the remaining arm begin to activate what was formerly hand cortex. And this reorganization is rapid, occurs within weeks and creates strange effects. Touching the face can produce sensations in the phantom hand, stroking the cheek can feel like stroking the missing fingers, and this shows that the cortical representation has been invaded, that face inputs now activate hand cortex, and the sensations are still localized to the phantom because the activity occurs in hand cortex, and the brain interprets activity in hand cortex as indicating sensations in the hand regardless of the actual source of the activity. The phantom limb paradox challenges the idea that sensations are simply caused by peripheral stimulation, shows that sensations can be generated centrally, can arise from brain activity without corresponding peripheral events, and this has implications for understanding pain, for recognizing that pain is not simply a signal from damaged tissue, but is a constructed experience that can occur without tissue damage, and chronic pain. Phantom pain, neuropathic pain are all examples of centrally generated sensations, are pains that arise from neural processes rather than from peripheral injury, and understanding phantom limbs helps understand these pain conditions, helps develop treatments that target the central nervous system rather than the periphery. The phenomenon also raises philosophical questions about the extended mind, about whether the body is part of the mind or is merely a tool used by the mind, and phantom limbs suggest that the body representation is part of the mind, is a core component of self-representation, and the representation persists even when the body part is gone. And this shows that the mind includes representations of the body, includes body schemas that are not simply passive reflections of physical structure, but are active constructs that shape experience. And the phantom limb is a representation without a referent, is a body part in the mind, but not in the world. And this dissociation shows that minds represent bodies, and representations can outlive what they represent. One variant of phantom limbs occurs in congenital amputees, people born without limbs, and some congenitally limbless individuals report phantom limbs, report feeling limbs they never had. And this is surprising, suggests that body schemas are not entirely learned, are not simply acquired through experience with actual body parts, but have some innate component, are partly specified by genetic programs that establish expected body structure. And when these programs run, they generate representations of limbs, even when those limbs never existed. And this shows that body schemas are not simply empirical generalizations from sensory experience, but are structured expectations about what bodies should be like. And the brain generates these representations even in the absence of corresponding body parts. Another implication concerns prosthetics, because if phantom limbs persist, if amputees continue to feel missing limbs, then prosthetics should be designed to interface with these phantom sensations, should provide feedback that is integrated with the phantom, and neuroprosthetics that read motor intentions from the brain or from remaining nerves can be controlled by the phantom, can allow amputees to move prosthetic limbs by moving their phantom limbs. And this creates a seamless interface, allows natural control, and the phantom limb, rather than being a problem, becomes a solution, becomes the interface between brain and prosthetic. And understanding phantoms has been crucial for developing advanced prosthetics that feel natural, that are experienced as extensions of the body rather than as external tools. The phantom also appears in other contexts: phantom breasts after mastectomy, phantom genitalia after surgery, phantom teeth after extraction, and all these phantoms reflect the same underlying mechanism, the persistence of neural representations after the represented body parts are removed. And the generality of the phenomenon shows that it is not specific to limbs, but applies to any body part. And body schemas for all body parts can persist as phantoms. And this universality suggests that phantoms reveal a general principle about how brains construct body representations, how these representations are maintained centrally, and how they can become dissociated from physical reality. The amputee feels the hand, phantom fingers that are not there, phantom movements that cannot occur, phantom pain in a location that does not exist, and the paradox persists. The brain maintains a representation despite the absence of the represented, and phantom limbs reveal that bodies are represented in brains, that these representations are stable, are resistant to updating, are constructed during development and maintained throughout life, and removal of body parts does not remove their representations, and the phantom remains, felt but not present, localized but not located, moving but motionless. And the paradox endures as one of the most striking phenomena in neuroscience, a demonstration that consciousness includes representations that can outlive their reference, that sensations can be generated centrally without peripheral causes, and that the body we feel is not simply the body we have, but is the body the brain represents. And sometimes these diverge and phantoms emerge, ghostly presences of absent limbs, and the phenomenon persists. The potato paradox. A farmer harvests 100 kilograms of potatoes, and these potatoes are 99% water by weight, meaning that only 1 kilogram is solid potato material and 99 kilograms is water. And the farmer leaves the potatoes out in the sun to dry, and after some time the water content has decreased. The potatoes are now 98% water instead of 99%. And the question is posed, how much do the potatoes weigh now? And the intuitive answer is that they have lost a little water, perhaps 1 kilogram, and so they now weigh 99 kilograms, or perhaps 98 kilograms. But this intuition is wildly wrong. The correct answer is that the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. They have lost half their weight, and this shocking result is the potato paradox, a puzzle about percentages and proportions that reveals how badly human intuition handles these concepts. The calculation proceeds as follows. The solid potato material, the non-water part, weighs 1 kilogram both before and after drying. This does not change. The potatoes lose water but not solid material. And before drying, this 1 kilogram of solid material represents 1% of the total weight, because the potatoes are 99% water and 1% solid, and after drying, this same 1 kilogram of solid material must represent 2% of the total weight, because the potatoes are now 98% water and therefore 2% solid. And if 1 kilogram is 2% of the total weight, then the total weight must be 50 kilograms, because 1 kilogram divided by 2% equals 50 kilograms. And so the potatoes have lost 50 kilograms of water, going from 100 kilograms to 50 kilograms, even though the percentage of water has decreased by only 1 percentage point, from 99% to 98%. The paradox reveals how deceptive percentages can be, how a small change in percentage can correspond to a large change in absolute quantity, and the confusion arises from conflating different reference points. The percentage of water is calculated relative to the total weight, which itself changes as water is lost. And so the meaning of 99% water before drying is different from the meaning of 98% water after drying, because the total weight is different. And this shifting reference point makes the percentage decrease seem small when in fact it corresponds to a massive, absolute loss of water. Another way to see the solution is to focus on the solid material. Before drying, the ratio of water to solid is 99:1, and after drying the ratio is 98:2, which simplifies to 49:1. And since the solid material remains 1 kilogram throughout, the water content must be 49 kilograms after drying, giving a total weight of 50 kilograms. And this calculation makes clear that the ratio of water to solid has nearly halved, from 99 parts water per part solid to 49 parts water per part solid. And this large change in ratio corresponds to the loss of half the total weight. The potato paradox has analogues in many real-world contexts where percentages and proportions are used. In economics, where small percentage changes in large quantities can represent enormous absolute changes. In medicine, where changes in concentrations or doses must be carefully calculated to avoid errors. In environmental science, where changes in atmospheric composition are measured in parts per million but can have large effects. And in all these contexts, the potato paradox serves as a warning that percentage changes can be misleading, that absolute quantities matter, and that careful calculation is necessary to avoid errors. The paradox also illustrates a general principle about proportions, that when the total changes, percentages relative to that total change in non-obvious ways, and that converting between percentages and absolute quantities requires attention to what the percentage is calculated relative to, and failure to track the denominator, failure to notice that the reference point is shifting, leads to systematic errors in reasoning, errors that the potato paradox exemplifies. Some people respond to the potato paradox by rejecting the premise, by arguing that potatoes cannot go from 99% water to 98% water by drying, that the numbers are unrealistic, but this response misses the point. The paradox is a thought experiment designed to illustrate mathematical relationships. And while the specific numbers may be exaggerated for effect, the underlying principle is sound, and similar calculations arise in realistic scenarios involving concentrations, dilutions, evaporations, and mixing, and understanding the potato paradox helps avoid errors in these practical contexts. The paradox is also pedagogically valuable. It is often used to teach proportional reasoning, to help students understand the difference between absolute and relative quantities, to emphasize the importance of identifying what a percentage is calculated relative to, and to show that intuition about percentages is often wrong, that careful calculation is necessary, and that problems involving changing totals require extra care. And students who master the potato paradox gain insight into a whole class of problems involving ratios, proportions, and percentages, problems that appear throughout mathematics, science, economics, and everyday life. The 100 kilograms of potatoes sit in the sun, water evaporating, and the percentage of water drops from 99 to 98. A change that sounds small, that feels negligible, and yet the weight has halved. 50 kilograms of water have disappeared, and the potatoes now weigh 50 kilograms. And this result shocks, violates expectation, reveals the gap between how percentages sound and what they mean, and the paradox endures, a simple problem with a surprising answer, a calculation that seems wrong but is right, a demonstration that percentages are tricky, that proportions shift in non-obvious ways, and that human intuition about these matters is unreliable, needs correction, needs training, needs the discipline of mathematics to avoid systematic error. And the paradox remains, taught in classrooms, discussed in puzzles, a permanent reminder that numbers are subtle, that context matters, that reference points shift, and that the gap between 99% and 98%, which sounds like 1%, can actually represent 50% of the total. And the potatoes shrink, the water evaporates, and the weight drops, and the paradox persists, elegant and instructive, a lesson in proportional reasoning wrapped in a story about potatoes and sunshine. The paradox of thrift. Saving money is virtuous, or so conventional wisdom holds. The careful individual who sets aside a portion of income, who resists the temptation to spend frivolously, who builds reserves against uncertain futures, is praised for responsibility and prudence. And yet there exists a paradox, articulated by economists and popularized by John Maynard Keynes, which suggests that if everyone tries to save more at the same time, the collective result is not increased wealth but decreased income, not prosperity but recession. And this is the paradox of thrift, a situation where individually rational behavior leads to collectively irrational outcomes, where virtue practiced universally becomes vice. The mechanism of the paradox operates through the relationship between spending and income in an economy, because one person's spending is another person's income. When you buy goods or services, you transfer money to the seller, who uses that money to pay employees and suppliers, who in turn spend it on other goods and services. And this circular flow of spending sustains employment and production. And if many people simultaneously decide to save more and spend less, then aggregate demand falls, businesses see reduced sales and respond by cutting production and laying off workers, and those who lose jobs or see reduced hours have less income, which forces them to reduce spending further, which causes more businesses to cut back. And this feedback loop drives the economy into recession, and in the recession, people earn less income, which means that despite their desire to save more, they may end up saving the same amount or even less than before, because their incomes have fallen, and so the collective attempt to increase savings fails. Defeated by the macroeconomic dynamics it sets in motion. The paradox challenges the microeconomic intuition that saving is always beneficial, that thrift is a virtue without qualification, and it reveals a divergence between individual rationality and collective welfare, a situation where what is good for each person taken separately is bad for everyone taken together. And this kind of divergence appears throughout economics, in the tragedy of the commons where individual overuse of shared resources leads to collective depletion, in the prisoner's dilemma where individual defection leads to mutually harmful outcomes, and in coordination failures where the inability to synchronize actions produces inefficiency. Keynes used the paradox of thrift to argue for government intervention during economic downturns, suggesting that when private sector spending collapses, the government should step in and increase public spending, running deficits if necessary to maintain aggregate demand and prevent the economy from spiraling into depression. And this idea became a cornerstone of Keynesian economics, influencing policy responses to recessions for decades, though it remains controversial, with critics arguing that government spending is inefficient, that deficits impose costs on future generations, that markets are self-correcting and will eventually restore full employment without intervention, and that the paradox of thrift does not apply in the long run because savings finance investment, which increases productive capacity and future income. The debate over the paradox of thrift touches on fundamental questions about how economies function, whether they are naturally stable or prone to instability, whether markets can coordinate the actions of millions of individuals efficiently, or whether coordination failures are common and require correction, and whether the behaviour that is rational for individuals is also rational for society, or whether there are systematic conflicts between private incentives and public welfare. The paradox also raises ethical and philosophical issues, because if individual virtue can produce collective harm, then the relationship between ethics and outcomes becomes more complex. The action that seems right from a personal perspective may contribute to suffering when widely practiced, and this suggests that moral evaluation cannot focus solely on individual actions, but must also consider systemic effects, the ways that individual choices aggregate into social outcomes, and whether there are actions that are permissible or even obligatory for individuals, but disastrous if universally adopted. The paradox of thrift connects to issues of time preference and uncertainty, because saving reflects a preference for future consumption over present consumption, a willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for future security, and this preference varies across individuals and across time, influenced by expectations about the future, by confidence in economic stability, by the availability of social insurance and safety nets. And when uncertainty increases, people tend to save more as a precaution, and this precautionary saving can trigger the paradox, can cause the very economic instability that people are trying to protect themselves against, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where fear of recession causes recession. The paradox also appears in the context of debt and deleveraging. When households or firms carry high levels of debt, they may all try to reduce their debt burdens simultaneously by saving more and spending less. And this collective deleveraging reduces aggregate demand and can cause a debt deflation spiral where falling prices and incomes make debt burdens even harder to service, leading to defaults and further economic contraction. And this dynamic was central to the Great Depression of the 1930s and the financial crisis of 2008, periods when the paradox of thrift was not merely a theoretical curiosity, but a lived reality affecting millions of people. Some economists question whether the paradox is genuine or whether it reflects a misunderstanding of economic dynamics, arguing that savings do not disappear from the economy but are channeled into investment. That when people save more, banks have more funds to lend to businesses for productive investments, and these investments create jobs and income, and so in the long run, increased saving leads to increased capital accumulation and higher living standards. And the paradox only appears in the short run, when there is a coordination problem, when the financial system fails to efficiently convert savings into investment, or when there is a liquidity trap where interest rates are already at zero and cannot fall further to stimulate investment. The paradox of thrift remains a central concept in macroeconomics, a reminder that economies are complex systems where individual actions interact in non-obvious ways, where feedback loops and emergent properties can produce outcomes that no one intended or desired, and where the aggregation of individual rationality does not necessarily produce collective rationality. And it stands as a challenge to simplistic economic thinking, to the idea that what is good for one is good for all, to the belief that markets automatically harmonize individual interests with social welfare, and it forces recognition that economic policy cannot be based solely on microeconomic principles, that understanding the economy requires attention to aggregate demand, to expectations and confidence, to the circular flow of income and spending, and to the possibility that individually prudent behavior can, under certain conditions, create collective disaster. And the paradox lingers as a warning that virtue is context-dependent, that actions are not good or bad in themselves, but only in relation to the circumstances in which they occur and the effects they produce, and that the attempt to secure individual futures through increased saving can, paradoxically, undermine those futures by damaging the economy on which everyone depends. The paradox of power. Why having power makes you lose it. A leader gains power through competence, through understanding others' needs, through empathy and social intelligence, through building coalitions and reading situations accurately. And these qualities enable the rise to power, enable winning support, enable navigating social hierarchies, and the leader reaches positions of authority, gains control over resources, gains ability to make decisions affecting others, and then something changes. The experience of having power alters the psychology of the powerful, reduces empathy, reduces perspective taking, increases confidence, increases risk taking, and these changes are the opposite of what brought power, are the erosion of the very qualities that enabled gaining power. And this is the paradox of power, described by psychologist Dacher Keltner and others. The finding that power changes people, makes them less attuned to others, less socially intelligent, less effective at the behaviours that won them power, and powerful people become entitled, become overconfident, become less accurate in reading social situations. And these changes lead to misuse of power, lead to decisions that harm subordinates, lead to loss of support, and eventually lead to loss of power itself. And the paradox shows that power contains the seeds of its own destruction, that having power undermines the qualities necessary to maintain power. And this cycle explains the rise and fall of leaders, explains why initial competence gives way to corruption or incompetence, explains why power corrupts. And the paradox has implications for understanding leadership, for recognizing that power is dangerous, that maintaining power requires deliberate effort to preserve the qualities that win power, requires resistance to the psychological effects of having power. Imagine the psychological changes that occur when someone gains power, gains control, gains authority, and research shows that power activates the behavioral approach system, increases focus on rewards, increases willingness to take risks, and simultaneously, power deactivates the behavioral inhibition system, reduces attention to threats, reduces concern about others' reactions, and these changes make powerful people more action-oriented, more decisive, but also less careful, less considerate. And experiments demonstrate this, show that people primed to feel powerful are more likely to interrupt others, to speak out of turn, to violate social norms, to take what they want without considering others, and powerful people literally see less, attend less to others' emotions, are worse at identifying facial expressions, are less accurate in reading social cues. And this reduced social intelligence is ironic because social intelligence is what typically wins power, is what enables navigating social hierarchies, and power reduces the very capacity that was necessary to gain it. The paradox of power demonstrates that power is self-undermining, that the experience of having power changes people in ways that make them worse at wielding power, that the psychological effects of power include overconfidence, reduced empathy, increased risk-taking, reduced constraint, and these effects lead to mistakes, lead to alienating subordinates, lead to poor decisions, and eventually lead to loss of power. And the cycle repeats. New leaders rise through empathy and social intelligence, gain power, lose these qualities, make mistakes, lose power. And the paradox is that the qualities needed to gain power are different from or opposite to the psychological effects of having power. And this mismatch drives the cycle, drives the rise and fall of leaders. And preventing the cycle requires awareness, requires powerful people to recognize the psychological effects of power and deliberately compensate, deliberately maintain empathy, deliberately attend to others, deliberately resist the natural effects of power. Visualize the paradox as a feedback loop. Gaining power reduces empathy. Reduced empathy leads to poor decisions. Poor decisions alienate supporters. Alienated supporters withdraw support. Withdrawn support leads to loss of power, and the loop is negative, is self-reinforcing, is a cycle that drives powerful people toward downfall. And breaking the loop requires intervention, requires powerful people to resist the psychological effects of power, requires institutional checks that constrain power, requires cultures that maintain accountability, and without such mechanisms, the loop runs its course, power leads to its own destruction, and the paradox unfolds. One mechanism underlying the paradox is the disinhibition effect, the finding that power reduces inhibition, reduces self-regulation, reduces the internal constraints that normally prevent people from acting on impulses, and powerful people feel freer to do what they want, feel less constrained by social norms, feel less concerned about consequences, and this freedom can be positive, can enable decisive action, can overcome excessive caution, but it also leads to inappropriate behavior, leads to violations of norms, leads to taking advantage of others, and the disinhibition effect explains many abuses of power, explains why powerful people harass subordinates, why they take liberties, why they feel entitled, and the effect is not intentional malice, but is psychological change caused by having power, is reduced inhibition that allows latent tendencies to manifest. Another mechanism is the decreased perspective taking, the finding that power reduces the ability and motivation to understand others' perspectives, to imagine how situations look from others' viewpoints, and powerful people focus on their own goals, their own needs, and pay less attention to others. And this reduced perspective taking makes powerful people worse at negotiation, worse at building consensus, worse at understanding how their actions affect others, and these deficits undermine effectiveness, undermine leadership, and create the conditions for losing power. And the paradox is complete. Power reduces the social intelligence needed to maintain power. One response to the paradox is institutional design, creating checks on power, creating accountability mechanisms, creating regular reviews or elections that force powerful people to maintain support. And democratic systems embody this, have regular elections that remove leaders who lose support, and corporate boards have review processes. And these institutions mitigate the paradox by making power conditional, by requiring continued demonstration of competence, by preventing the complacency that power breeds. And effective institutions recognize the paradox, recognize that power corrupts, and design around it, create structures that limit the damage caused by the psychological effects of power. Another response is leadership development, training leaders to recognize the paradox, to understand the psychological effects of power, to deliberately maintain empathy and perspective-taking. And research shows that awareness helps, that leaders who understand the paradox are better at resisting its effects, are more likely to maintain the qualities that won them power, and leadership training increasingly includes content about the psychology of power, about the importance of humility, about the need to deliberately attend to others despite the psychological pull towards self-focus. And this training aims to break the cycle, aims to help powerful people resist the natural effects of power. A third response is cultural, creating organizational cultures that value empathy, that reward perspective-taking, that punish abuse of power. And some organizations succeed at this, create environments where power does not corrupt, where leaders remain accountable, remain connected to subordinates. And these cultures require work, require deliberate effort to maintain, require norms that constrain power, that make abuse costly, and they require exemplars, require leaders who model healthy use of power, who demonstrate that power can be wielded without corruption. And these cultural interventions show that the paradox is not inevitable, is not deterministic, but can be managed through collective effort. The paradox also connects to ancient wisdom, to the recognition across cultures and eras that power corrupts, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, that leaders must guard against the temptations of power. And philosophers from Plato to Confucius recognized the paradox, recognized that power changes people, and their advice remains relevant, remains a warning that power is dangerous, that vigilance is necessary, that humility is essential, and the paradox of power shows that this ancient wisdom is psychologically accurate, is confirmed by modern research, is not merely moral preaching, but is description of how power actually affects people. The leader rises, gains authority, controls resources, makes decisions, and power begins its work, reduces empathy, increases overconfidence, loosens inhibitions, and the leader becomes less effective, less attuned, more self-focused, makes mistakes, alienates supporters, and the fall begins, and the paradox completes its arc. Power undermines itself. The qualities that won power are lost, and new leaders rise to repeat the cycle, and the paradox of power endures as a permanent feature of leadership, as a psychological reality that must be managed, that must be resisted, that must be constrained through institutions and culture and awareness. And the paradox remains inevitable and destructive unless deliberately countered, unless powerful people recognize the effects and fight them, unless societies build structures that limit the damage and the cycle continues. The rise and fall driven by the paradox that having power undermines the ability to keep it. The paradox of value, why what we need most costs least. An economist contemplates the nature of value, asks what makes things valuable, what determines worth, and observes a fundamental puzzle that prices seem disconnected from importance, that markets assign high prices to luxuries and low prices to necessities, that goods essential for human flourishing cost little while goods that serve vanity or status cost fortunes. And this is the paradox of value, the broader version of the diamond water paradox, the puzzle that spans across all goods and services. And the paradox asks why healthcare is expensive, while entertainment is cheap in some places and the reverse in others, why teachers are paid less than entertainers, why life-saving drugs are affordable in some markets and unaffordable in others, why the allocation of value by markets seems misaligned with human needs, with moral worth, with social importance. And this paradox has troubled economic thinking since ancient times, has been discussed by philosophers from Aristotle to Marx, and while modern economics offers explanations through supply and demand, through marginal utility, through market equilibrium, the paradox retains moral force, retains the sense that something is wrong, that prices should reflect importance, that markets fail to value correctly, and the paradox of value remains a central challenge for defending market allocation, for justifying price mechanisms, for explaining why efficient markets can produce what seem like perverse valuations. Imagine comparing different goods by their importance to human welfare. And air is essential, sustains life, is necessary for survival, cannot be done without for more than minutes, and yet air is free, has zero price, costs nothing. While gold is non-essential, serves no biological function, is desired only for decoration or a store of value, and yet gold is expensive, costs thousands per ounce, and this comparison illustrates the paradox, shows that necessity and price are inversely related, that the most needed goods are often cheapest and the least needed goods often expensive. And this pattern extends across many goods. Water is cheap, housing varies but is often expensive, healthcare is expensive in many places, education costs are rising, food prices are moderate, while luxuries like jewellery, sports cars, yachts, artwork, all command premium prices. And the pattern suggests that markets value incorrectly, value luxury over necessity, value status over survival. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that market allocation is unjust, is misaligned with human values. The paradox of value demonstrates the tension between exchange value, what markets assign, and use value, what humans need. And Marx emphasized this distinction, argued that capitalism systematically undervalues use value, undervalues goods necessary for life, while overvaluing exchange value, overvaluing goods that serve accumulation. And this misalignment is not accidental, but is structural, is inherent in market systems that allocate based on willingness to pay rather than on need. And those with money can bid up prices of luxuries, while those without cannot bid up prices of necessities. And markets respond to money, not to need. And this explains the paradox. It explains why diamonds are expensive and water cheap. Because those who want diamonds have money to pay high prices, while those who need water cannot afford high prices. And markets clear at prices that balance supply and demand among those with purchasing power, not among all humans with needs. Visualize the paradox as revealing different concepts of value: economic value, defined by market prices determined by supply and demand, and purchasing power, and moral or social value, defined by importance to human welfare, determined by needs and flourishing. And these two concepts diverge, are not aligned. And economic value is amoral, is neutral about what should be valued, reflects only what is valued by those with money to spend, while moral value judges that some goods are more important than others, that necessities matter more than luxuries, that human needs should be prioritized. And the paradox is the gap between these concepts, is the recognition that markets do not track moral value, do not allocate according to importance. And this gap creates the sense that markets are unjust, are inadequate for distributing goods that matter most. One response to the paradox of value is that markets are efficient, are good at allocating resources to maximize satisfaction of preferences weighted by willingness to pay. And while this may not align with moral importance, it is the best available system, is better than alternatives, like central planning, which face information problems and incentive problems. And markets at least respond to decentralized information about preferences, at least allow individuals to make choices. And efficiency does not require tracking moral importance, requires only that resources go to those who value them most as measured by willingness to pay. And this response accepts the paradox, accepts that markets do not and should not track moral value, argues that moral allocation should be achieved through other means, through taxation and redistribution, through public provision of essential goods, through regulation that ensures access to necessities, and markets should be left to allocate efficiently while other institutions address moral concerns. Another response questions whether the paradox is real, argues that necessities actually are valuable, are provided at low cost because markets are efficient at producing them, because competition drives prices down, and the reason necessities are cheap is that we have solved the production problem, have made them abundant, and abundance is good, is the goal. And the paradox mistakes low price for low value, confuses market price with social importance. And in fact, low prices for necessities mean high consumer surplus, mean people benefit greatly from access to cheap necessities. And this is success, not failure. Is markets working well? Not markets failing. And the paradox dissolves once we recognize that low prices for necessities reflect abundance and efficiency rather than lack of value, and high prices for luxuries reflect scarcity and inefficiency rather than high value. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that markets misallocate, argues that essential goods should not be left to markets, should be provided through public systems, through universal healthcare, through public education, through subsidized housing, and markets can allocate luxuries, can determine who gets diamonds and yachts. But necessities are different, require different allocation mechanisms, require ensuring universal access regardless of ability to pay. And this social democratic response uses the paradox to argue for limits on markets, for sectors where market allocation is inappropriate, where public provision is necessary, and the paradox becomes an argument for mixed economies, for market allocation in some domains and public allocation in others. The paradox also appears in labour markets, where compensation seems misaligned with social importance, and teachers are paid less than entertainers, nurses less than financiers, social workers less than lawyers, and this pattern suggests that markets undervalue socially important work, undervalue contributions to welfare and education and care, while overvaluing contributions to entertainment and finance. And this creates moral discomfort, creates the sense that labour markets are unjust, and explaining the pattern requires understanding supply and demand for labour, requires recognising that compensation reflects scarcity and productivity as measured by market value, not social importance, and teachers are abundant relative to demand while CEOs are scarce, and market productivity of CEOs as measured by profit contribution exceeds that of teachers. And these factors determine compensation, not social importance. And this explains the pattern but does not eliminate the moral concern, does not resolve the sense that something is wrong with a system that pays entertainers more than educators. Some argue that the paradox of value reveals limits of price as measure of value, reveals that not everything important can be priced, that some goods resist commodification, that markets are appropriate for some goods and inappropriate for others, and market prices are useful for allocating produced commodities but are inadequate for allocating access to health, education, safety, justice, and these latter goods require different allocation mechanisms, require treating them as rights or entitlements rather than as commodities to be purchased. And the paradox supports this view, supports the idea that markets have limits, that not everything should be for sale, that some forms of value resist market logic. The necessities remain cheap, the luxuries remain expensive, and the paradox persists. Prices diverge from importance, exchange value diverges from use value, markets allocate without regard to need, and the pattern continues, and the paradox of value endures as a permanent feature of market systems, endures as a moral challenge to market allocation, and resolving the tension requires either accepting that markets are amoral, are efficient but not just, and supplementing markets with institutions that ensure access to necessities, or rejecting markets for essential goods, replacing market allocation with public provision. And the paradox remains unresolved and troubling, showing that what we need most costs least, that prices do not track importance, that markets value incorrectly from a moral perspective, even if correctly from an economic perspective, and the paradox endures. The 5 phenomenon, why motion is an illusion your brain creates. 2 lights flash in sequence. First, one light turns on and off. Then a moment later, another light nearby turns on and off. And yet what you perceive is not 2 separate flashes, but a single light moving from the first position to the second. Continuous motion where there is none. Smooth travel through space that never occurred. And this is the 5 phenomenon, discovered by Max Wertheimer in 1912. a fundamental illusion that reveals how the brain constructs the perception of motion, shows that motion is not simply detected from sensory input, but is created, is synthesized by the visual system from discrete static images. And the phi phenomenon is the principle behind movies and television, where still frames flashed rapidly create the illusion of continuous motion, where characters seem to move smoothly when they are really just a sequence of frozen images. And understanding phi reveals that all motion perception involves construction, involves the brain interpreting changes and inferring movement. And motion is not a basic sensory property, but is a higher level interpretation, a perceptual inference that usually corresponds to reality, but can be fooled, can be triggered by appropriate sequences, even when nothing actually moves. And the phi phenomenon stands as evidence that perception is actively constructed rather than passively recorded, that what we see is not simply what is there, but is what the brain interprets as being there. Imagine the experimental setup. 2 dots on a screen, separated by some distance, and the first dot appears briefly, vanishes. Then after a short delay, the second dot appears, and if the timing and spacing are right, you do not see 2 sequential flashes, but see 1 dot moving from the first position to the second, sliding smoothly across the space between them. And this apparent motion, this phi, is so compelling that it feels exactly like real motion, indistinguishable phenomenologically from watching an object actually travel through space. And yet nothing moved. No object traversed the gap. There were only 2 separate stationary flashes, and the motion exists only in your perception, is constructed by your brain from the temporal sequence. The phi phenomenon reveals that the visual system assumes continuity, assumes that when similar stimuli appear in nearby locations in rapid succession, they are probably the same object in motion. And this assumption is usually correct, is how motion in the real world works. Objects move continuously from place to place, and perceiving them as moving requires detecting this spatio-temporal pattern, and the visual system has evolved to detect this pattern efficiently, to infer motion from sequences of static retinal images, and phi exploits this mechanism, presents the pattern without the actual motion, and the brain responds as it normally does, constructs motion perception, and the illusion demonstrates that motion is not directly given in sensation, but is computed from changes in position over time. Visualize motion perception as involving motion detectors, neurons that respond to changes in position, to objects moving across the visual field, and these detectors can be activated by real motion or by appropriate sequences of static stimuli. And phi activates these detectors, creates the neural signature of motion without actual motion. And the brain cannot distinguish between motion signals caused by real movement and motion signals caused by phi sequences. And so phi creates genuine motion perception, creates the subjective experience of seeing something move. And this shows that motion perception is a neural state that can be produced by different causes, by real motion or by well-timed sequences. And the experience is the same, regardless of cause. The phi phenomenon differs from other apparent motion phenomena, differs from beta motion, which is pure displacement without phenomenal movement, differs from stroboscopic motion, which is the specific type of motion seen in films, and phi is the perception of smooth, continuous movement, is the most compelling type of apparent motion. Most closely resembles real motion, and understanding the distinctions between different types of apparent motion reveals the complexity of the motion perception system, reveals that there are multiple mechanisms, multiple ways the brain computes motion, and phi is one specific mechanism, the mechanism that creates smooth motion perception from discrete temporal sequences. Gestalt psychologists like Wertheimer used phi to argue against elementalist theories of perception, against theories that said perception is built up from simple sensations combined according to associations, and phi shows that perception is not a sum of elements, not a combination of 2 flashes, but is a holistic interpretation. is motion that emerges from the relationship between flashes, and the whole is different from the sum of parts, and this Gestalt insight-shaped psychology influenced how perception came to be understood as involving organization and interpretation rather than simple sensation. And Fee became a canonical example, a demonstration that perception is constructive, is synthetic, creates experiences that go beyond the sensory input. The phi phenomenon also has philosophical implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you experience in phi is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion, and yet no motion occurred in the stimulus. And this raises questions about the relationship between experience and reality, about whether experiences are always caused by corresponding physical events. And phi shows they are not, shows that the same experience can be caused by different physical processes, by real motion, or by sequential flashes. And this supports functionalist theories of consciousness, supports the view that conscious experiences are not tied to specific physical substrates, but are computational states that can be realized in multiple ways. One implication of phi for film and animation is that smooth motion can be created with relatively low frame rates. As long as frames are spaced appropriately in time and space, the phi phenomenon will create smooth motion perception. And this is why movies work at 24 frames per second, why television works at similar rates. The temporal gaps between frames are short enough that phi fills them in, creates continuous motion, and filmmakers exploit phi to create realistic movement, to make still images come alive. And understanding phi has been crucial to developing motion picture technology, to optimizing frame rates and timing. Another implication concerns perceptual boundaries, concerns what counts as seeing motion versus what counts as inferring motion, because phi feels like seeing motion, feels like direct perception, not like making an inference or having a belief. And yet phi is constructed, is synthesized by the brain from discrete inputs, and this raises questions about where perception ends and cognition begins, whether the boundary is sharp or gradual, whether there are clear distinctions between seeing and thinking, or whether perception shades continuously into cognition. And phi sits on this boundary, is simultaneously perceptual, immediate, and phenomenologically direct and cognitive, involving complex processing and interpretation. The lights flash in sequence and motion appears, smooth travel from first to second, and nothing moved, only the brain moved from sensing to interpreting, from input to output. And phi emerges, motion created from stillness, continuity created from discontinuity. And the phenomenon reveals the constructive nature of perception, reveals that experience is not a mirror of reality, but is a model constructed by the brain, a model that usually tracks reality accurately, but can be manipulated, can be triggered by artificial sequences. And the phi phenomenon endures as one of the foundational discoveries in perceptual psychology, a demonstration that motion is not given but is made, is not detected but is computed, and every motion you see, real or apparent, involves this same computation, this same construction. And phi makes the construction explicit, shows that what seems most immediate, most directly perceived, is actually mediated, is processed, is inferred, and motion is an illusion, a useful, accurate illusion usually, but an illusion nonetheless. And phi reveals this, and the lights flash on. The paradox of non-being, how nothing cannot be talked about. A philosopher attempts to state a simple truth, attempts to say that something does not exist, attempts to assert that unicorns are not real, that they have no being, that they are nothing, and yet stating this seems impossible, seems paradoxical, because to say that unicorns do not exist is to say something about unicorns, is to refer to them, to make them the subject of a statement. And how can you refer to what does not exist? How can you make something the subject of a statement if that something is nothing, if it has no being? And if you can refer to unicorns, then they must be something, must have some kind of being. But then the statement unicorns do not exist is false, is contradictory, because it refers to things that it claims do not exist. And this is the paradox of non-being, first articulated by Plato in the Sophist, the puzzle about how negative existential statements are possible, how we can truly say that something does not exist without contradicting ourselves, without presupposing the existence of what we are denying exists. And this paradox has troubled metaphysics throughout history, has generated multiple solutions, and remains a test case for theories of reference and existence. Imagine trying to deny the existence of something, trying to say that Zeus does not exist, that there is no such God, and the statement seems straightforward, seems obviously true, but analysing the statement reveals problems because the statement is about Zeus, makes Zeus the subject, and subjects of statements must be something, must have reference, must be objects that the statement is about. And if Zeus is the subject, then Zeus must exist in some sense, must be something rather than nothing. But the statement says Zeus does not exist, says Zeus is nothing. And so the statement seems self-refuting, seems to both presuppose and deny the existence of its subject. And this is the paradox, that negative existentials, statements denying existence, seem impossible to state without contradiction. Parmenides made this paradox central to his philosophy, argued that non-being cannot be spoken of or thought about, because speaking and thinking require objects, require that there be something that is spoken of or thought about. And non-being is not something, is nothing. And so non-being is inexpressible, unthinkable. And from this Parmenides concluded that non-being does not exist, that everything that is exists, that reality is one unchanging being, and change is impossible because change would require something to come into being from non-being or to pass into non-being, and both are impossible. And this radical conclusion follows from taking the paradox of non-being seriously, from accepting that we cannot coherently speak of what does not exist. Visualize the paradox as a linguistic trap. When you say X does not exist, you seem to refer to X, and reference requires that X be something, and if X is something, then X exists. And so the statement is self-refuting, and yet negative existentials seem to be true, seem to be among the most basic truths. And we need to explain how they can be true without contradiction, how we can deny existence without presupposing it. And this requires a theory of reference that allows reference to non-existence, or that reinterprets negative existentials so they do not really refer to their apparent subjects. One solution proposed by Russell denies that names like Zeus refer to objects, analyzes them as disguised descriptions, and Zeus does not exist becomes, there is no unique object that has all the properties attributed to Zeus in mythology. And this existential statement does not refer to Zeus, does not presuppose any object, but simply denies that the description is satisfied. And this allows negative existentials to be true, without paradox, without reference to non-existence. And Russell's theory of descriptions has been widely adopted as solving the paradox, as showing that negative existentials do not actually have the logical form they appear to have, do not refer to their apparent subjects. Another solution from free logic distinguishes between existence and reference, allows that terms can refer without presupposing existence, and negative existentials are statements that deny existence while preserving reference, and this requires revising classical logic, requires allowing that some terms refer to nothing, are empty names, and statements containing empty names can still be meaningful, can still have truth values. And Zeus does not exist is true because Zeus is an empty name, refers to nothing, and the statement denies existence without presupposing it. And free logic has been developed extensively, provides formal semantics for empty names, and handles the paradox by liberalizing logic to allow reference without existence. A third solution, from Meinongian approaches, accepts that non-existent objects are real in a broad sense, have being even if they lack existence, and Zeus does not exist is true, because Zeus is a non-existent object, has being but lacks existence, and statements about Zeus refer to this non-existent object, and the paradox is dissolved because reference does not require existence, only requires being, and non-existent objects have being, have properties, can be subjects of true statements, and this solution preserves the intuition that negative existentials refer to their subjects, while denying that reference requires existence. The paradox also appears in discussions of nothingness, of absolute non-being, because to say that absolute nothing is impossible seems to require referring to absolute nothing, making it the subject of a statement, and if it is the subject, then it must be something. And so the statement that nothing is impossible presupposes that nothing is something, and this generates contradiction, and Heidegger made this paradox central to his philosophy, explored the nature of nothingness, argued that nothing is not a thing but is the horizon of being, the possibility of non-being that makes being intelligible, and discussing nothing requires special language, requires recognizing that nothing is not an object but is something more fundamental, and the paradox shows limits of ordinary language, shows that metaphysics pushes language beyond its designed capacities. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, accept that there are true contradictions, dialetheas, statements that are both true and false, and negative existentials are examples, are both true because they correctly deny existence, and false because they refer to their subjects, and reference presupposes existence. And this paraconsistent approach accepts contradiction, develops logics that allow true contradictions without explosion, without allowing everything to be provable. And while controversial, paraconsistent logic provides one way of handling the paradox, accepts that negative existentials are genuinely paradoxical, are both true and false. The statement stands: Zeus does not exist, unicorns are not real, nothing is something, and the paradox remains, hovering over negative existentials, challenging theories of reference, forcing recognition that denying existence is not as simple as it seems, that we cannot straightforwardly say that something is nothing without creating logical tension, and the paradox of non-being endures as one of the oldest problems in philosophy, a problem recognized by Plato, central to Parmenides, unresolved by centuries of analysis. And various solutions exist, various ways of dissolving or accepting the paradox, but no consensus emerges, and the paradox persists, a reminder that language struggles to express non-existence, that negation creates puzzles, and that the boundary between being and non-being resists clear articulation. The paradox of the ravens, yet another formulation of Hempel's problem. The paradox appears under multiple names because different philosophers have formulated it independently or emphasized different aspects, and the paradox of the ravens is essentially identical to the paradox of confirmation and to the raven paradox, all referring to Hempel's discovery that observing non-black non-ravens logically confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black, and this formulation emphasizes the ravens themselves, emphasizes that the hypothesis is about a specific class of objects, ravens, and yet evidence can come from observing completely different objects, apples and shoes and clouds, and the paradoxical nature lies in this disconnect between what the hypothesis is about and what confirms it, between the subject matter and the evidence, and calling it the paradox of the ravens highlights this strange relationship, makes explicit that ravens are the subject of the hypothesis, but need not be the subject of confirming observations. The multiplicity of names reflects the paradox's importance, its centrality to philosophy of science, because a problem this fundamental is rediscovered repeatedly, is approached from different angles, and each formulation brings slightly different emphasis, highlights different aspects of the puzzle, and some formulations focus on confirmation theory, on the formal logic of evidence, while others focus on scientific practice, on what scientists actually do when testing hypotheses, and still others focus on intuitions, on the clash between logical conclusions and common sense judgments. And all these perspectives are valuable, all contribute to understanding the paradox, and the proliferation of names is a sign of the paradox's richness, its ability to raise questions at multiple levels, from technical issues in confirmation theory to broad questions about scientific method. The paradox also connects to debates about Bayesian versus frequentist approaches to statistics and inference, because Bayesians have a ready answer to the paradox, can explain using Bayes' theorem why red apples confirm that all ravens are black, but provide only negligible confirmation, while frequentists struggle more, find it harder to explain the asymmetry between observing ravens and observing non-ravens. And this has led some philosophers to see the raven paradox as evidence for Bayesianism, as showing that Bayesian methods are better equipped to handle confirmation than classical approaches, though others argue that the paradox is not decisive, that various approaches can accommodate it with appropriate modifications. The paradox remains a standard topic in philosophy curricula, a problem that every student encounters. And despite its age, despite being formulated in the 1940s, it continues to generate discussion, continues to appear in new papers and books, because it is simple enough to explain quickly, deep enough to sustain extended analysis, and challenging enough that no solution is universally accepted. And this combination makes it pedagogically valuable and philosophically important, a paradox that serves both as an introduction to philosophy of science and as a topic for advanced research. The ravens circle overhead, black against the sky, and each sighting confirms what we already believed, that ravens are black, and elsewhere apples sit in bowls, red and green and yellow, and logic says these two are evidence about ravens, and the paradox persists, a permanent feature of confirmation theory, a problem that every account of scientific reasoning must address. And the paradox endures under its many names, always the same underlying puzzle, always the same challenge to explain how evidence works, what confirms hypotheses, and why common sense and formal logic sometimes diverge. And the paradox of the ravens remains, waiting for each new generation of philosophers to confront it, to propose solutions, to argue about confirmation, and to recognize that even basic concepts in science conceal philosophical depths that resist easy resolution. The philosophical zombie argument, why consciousness might not come from physics. A creature walks among us that looks exactly like a human being, molecule for molecule identical, atom for atom the same, every neuron firing in the same patterns, every behavior perfectly matched. And this creature speaks as we speak, acts as we act, responds to pain by withdrawing, to beauty by smiling, to loss by crying, and yet inside there is nothing. No subjective experience, no consciousness, no inner light, no feeling of what it is like to be this creature, and this being is called a philosophical zombie, or P-zombie, a thought experiment in philosophy of mind that challenges physicalism, challenges the view that consciousness is nothing more than physical processes, and the zombie argument asks us to imagine such creatures, to consider whether they are conceivable, and if they are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible, and if they are possible, then consciousness cannot be identical to physical processes, cannot be reduced to brain states, because the zombie has all the physical processes but lacks consciousness. And this shows that consciousness is something extra, something additional to the physical. And this is the philosophical zombie argument, deployed by David Chalmers and others to defend property dualism, to argue that subjective experience is not reducible to objective physical facts. And the argument remains one of the most debated arguments in contemporary philosophy of mind. Imagine encountering a zombie, engaging in conversation, watching it navigate the world, and nothing in its behavior betrays the absence of consciousness. It claims to be conscious, describes its experiences in first-person terms, acts exactly as a conscious being would act, and the only difference, the only divergence between zombie and human is the inner life. The presence or absence of subjective experience, and the zombie has none, is dark inside, operates purely through physical mechanisms without any accompanying phenomenology, and the argument asks whether such a being is conceivable, whether we can coherently imagine it, and if we can, then consciousness is not necessitated by physical structure, is not entailed by brain processes, and physicalism fails, and some form of dualism must be true. The argument can be stated formally as follows: it is conceivable that there be zombies, creatures physically identical to humans, but lacking consciousness. If zombies are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible. If zombies are metaphysically possible, then consciousness is not identical to physical processes. Therefore, consciousness is not identical to physical processes. And this conclusion challenges materialism, challenges the view that everything is physical, that mental states are brain states, and forces recognition of an explanatory gap, a gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts that cannot be bridged by physical explanation alone. Visualize two worlds. One is our world, filled with conscious beings who have inner lives, who experience redness and pain and joy, and the other is zombie world, physically identical. Every particle in the same position, every force acting identically, but lacking consciousness. All beings are zombies, and the question is whether zombie world is possible, whether it is a coherent scenario, and Chalmers argues that it is, that we can conceive of such a world without contradiction, and this conceivability establishes possibility, and possibility refutes physicalism, shows that physical facts do not exhaust all facts, that there are phenomenal facts that are additional to physical facts. Physicalists respond to the zombie argument in multiple ways. The most direct response denies that zombies are conceivable, argues that the apparent conceivability is illusory, that we think we can imagine zombies because we are not thinking carefully enough, not considering all the implications, and that when we try to fill in the details, try to specify exactly how a zombie would work, contradictions emerge, and zombies turn out to be impossible after all. And this response requires showing that consciousness is entailed by physical structure, that given the right physical organization, consciousness must arise. And this is the hard part, explaining why and how physical processes necessitate consciousness. Another response accepts that zombies are conceivable, but denies that conceivability implies possibility, argues that there is a gap between what we can imagine and what is actually possible, that conceivability is an epistemic notion about what seems possible to us, while possibility is a metaphysical notion about what could actually be. And these can come apart. We can conceive of things that are actually impossible, like water being something other than H2O. And Kripke's work on necessity and identity supports this, shows that identities, like water is H2O, are necessary, even though we can conceive of their negation. And the same applies to consciousness, is brain process. It might be necessarily true, even though we can conceive of its negation. And so zombies, while conceivable, are not possible, and the zombie argument fails. A third response argues that the zombie argument begs the question, assumes what it sets out to prove, because the claim that zombies are conceivable assumes that consciousness is something separable from physical processes, something that could be absent while physical processes remain. And this assumption is precisely what physicalists deny. And so the argument does not refute physicalism, but merely asserts an alternative view. And physicalists are not obliged to accept the zombie scenario as genuinely conceivable, can reject it as incoherent or question-begging. The zombie argument connects to other arguments about consciousness, to the knowledge argument about Mary, and to the explanatory gap, and to the hard problem of consciousness, all pointing to the difficulty of explaining subjective experience in physical terms. all suggesting that phenomenal consciousness resists reduction. And these arguments collectively create a case for dualism, for the view that consciousness is not physical, though the case remains controversial, remains rejected by many philosophers who maintain that consciousness will eventually be explained physically, that the apparent gap is due to ignorance, not to genuine irreducibility. The zombie walks through the world, behaving normally, seeming conscious, and yet the question hangs: is there anyone home? Is there subjective experience? Or is the creature an automaton, a sophisticated mechanism that mimics consciousness without having it? And the zombie argument uses this thought experiment to probe the nature of consciousness, to test whether consciousness can be separated from physical structure. And the answer determines whether physicalism is true, whether everything about consciousness can be explained in physical terms, or whether consciousness is something more, something that transcends the physical. And the zombie remains, conceivable or not, possible or not, a thought experiment that continues to challenge materialist theories of mind, continues to force physicalists to explain how consciousness arises from matter, how subjective experience emerges from objective processes, and the philosophical zombie endures as one of the most vivid and controversial thought experiments in philosophy. A creature that may be impossible, but whose mere conceivability threatens physicalism, whose imagined existence reveals the explanatory gap between brain and mind, between matter and consciousness, and whether zombies could exist remains disputed, remains a test case for theories of consciousness. And the zombie argument persists as a central challenge to the view that science can explain everything, that physical facts exhaust all facts, and that consciousness is nothing more than brain processes arranged in certain ways.